Welcome to the A/B Testing in Practice workshop. We're thankful to have Leemay Nassery from Spotify leading this session. My name is Brandon Krakowski. I'm the head of experiential learning and education at Analytics at Wharton. Let me just tell you a little bit about our other workshop offerings and on-demand learning opportunities. So we host a variety of workshops every couple of weeks. We have an upcoming session on April 2nd, AI and entrepreneurship. That'll be led by Jaden Tokopoulos, our data scientist. We also have on-demand learning offerings. You can develop your skills at your own pace. Open to all of Penn staff or students. You can go to this link for a lot of different offerings. We host all the recordings from these live sessions. Past sessions include storytelling and research, coding with co-pilots, online controlled A/B testing. That's Leemay's previous session. We also have online modules where you can learn at your own pace, completely self-guided multi-week modules. Some of these include Intro to SQL, Intro to Python, we have Intro to Data Visualization, Intro to Big Data. Coming soon, we'll have Intro to AI, and we'll also have an Intro to Data Analytics set of modules. We also have courses on Coursera, taught by both faculty and staff at Penn, Business Analytics Specialization, AI for Business Specialization, Introduction to Programming with Python and Java Specialization. That's one that I teach, and I'll have another one in the fall called How to Use Data, which will be on Coursera. Today's session, led by Leemay, will demonstrate A/B testing concepts through case studies from the lens of an analyst running experiments on a product. Leemay is an engineering leader at Spotify. She also wrote a book, Practical A/B Testing, if you're interested. Fun fact, she's never seen Star Wars. I don't know. You can take that up with her. If you like today's session, stay tuned for the fall. She's going to be teaching a 6-part practical and applied A/B testing not-for-credit course on campus that we're going to host over the course of 3 to 4 weeks. This will culminate with an A/B testing project and student competition. So, okay.
I think about AI and entrepreneurship for hours. I'd like to come to that. What does that mean? I think I know what it means. All right, hello. A/B testing in practice. Let's get started. I've already done the introductions, but again, my name is Leemay. I'm the author of A/B testing in practice, or practical A/B testing, writing a second book on more advanced topics. I work at Spotify on the homepage on experimentation problem spaces and a bunch of other cool problem spaces. It's a great company. I highly recommend it. I've also worked at Etsy, Dropbox, and Comcast. Also great companies. Let me give you a taste of what you are in for the next hour or so. We will set the foundation for what A/B testing is at a really high level, theory and in practice. And then we will go into a case study where you all will play the role of analyst. This case study is highly inspired by all of the companies that I've worked at. So highly inspired by my experiences running A/B tests at Spotify, Etsy, Dropbox, and Comcast. Okay, A/B testing in theory. So A/B testing, foundationally, is a type of online controlled experiment where you are introducing users to a change and you want to measure that change. It's a methodology that's used in product development if you want to, quote unquote, innovate, if you want to leverage AI, if you want to experiment with ML, if you want to introduce a new UX change. You typically run an experiment to evaluate the effect or measure the impact. Super simple example. You've got 2 pots, you have some seeds, you define an independent variable, the amount of water. Take note of the word independent, that's super important. One pot gets water, the other doesn't. What happens? Very simple, right? Okay, so in practice, A/B testing is a little bit different. This is an example of a great product development lifecycle. This is like A+. Not a lot of companies do this. Companies that do this value data and experimentation and really understanding the impact of their changes. It's an investment. A/B testing in practice does take a lot of infrastructure, a lot of data, a lot of analysis time. But if you read my book, you can also start with very little. Like, for example, when I worked at Comcast, I think the team that we had running an A/B test was 4 people. The team that we have at Spotify, way bigger. So it just depends on the appetite the company has for running A/B tests on the product. Anyway, sort of very high level, just so that we're setting the foundation and we're all on the same page. A great product development lifecycle starts with user research studies. Those user research studies are where you ask users like about their pain points, or you give them a mock UI and they navigate it, and you kind of see like how they're experiencing or what they're doing with that feature. And then you define product requirements based on those user research studies. Then the engineering team builds it. Then maybe you do some offline evaluation if you are leveraging AI on the product or ML. And then you A/B test. So that's the online stage where you evaluate the change on a subset of users. Depending on the results, you either iterate or you launch. All right, so let's touch on the fundamentals of an A/B test. This is important because we're going to talk about these concepts during the case study when we're looking at a specific A/B test. So you have your hypothesis, which is what are you predicting? What do you believe to be the case, and why are you essentially running this experiment? And then how are you going to measure what you believe to be the case with key metrics? So that's things like revenue, consumption share, active users, click-through rate, video consumption, which we'll go into in the case study. It's essentially like how are you going to measure what you're doing is indeed doing it? And then you have treatment and control. So those are two subgroups. Those are two user cohorts, or not cohorts, there's two segments that are randomly selected. Users are randomly selected to be in the treatment and control segment. The treatment gets the change, the control does not, right? Hopefully none of these are new concepts. I don't think they are where you all are at in your careers. So, some key factors. Every experiment needs a control group. It's not enough just to analyze just the treatment. Factors outside the experiment might move user behavior. If you just looked at the treatment group only, you might misattribute effect to our experiment intervention. So it's important to always have a control group. Don't think that you can just have a treatment and measure it. You should be comparing. And randomization is so important. Allocating users to a treatment and control group at random is key to combat selection bias, which we will go into a little bit in the next slides. Just remember selection bias. You don't want that. All right, confounding factors. This is another key term. So all these terms I'm mentioning, we kind of touch upon in our case study. In statistics, confounder is a variable that influences both the dependent variable and independent variable, causing false association. Like emphasize on false association. Let's take this really interesting graph. For example, ice cream is causing an increase in drowning deaths. Does anyone actually believe that? If you just looked at the graph. Yeah, I mean, it looks like there's a correlation. It looks like they're both moving in the same direction. In the summer, there's more deaths, and in the summer, there's more ice cream production, right? Makes sense. This is actually not causation. This is where you hear a lot of people say correlation is not causation. It's what the cool people say. There's a key variable or factor at play, and that is seasonality. And so as a data scientist, like these are the things that matter. Like this is the way you have to be thinking. You can't just look at a graph. You can't just look at a visualization. Like you actually have to look at the data and what the data is telling you. A lot of people say with A/B testing, it tells you what happened, but it doesn't tell you why it happened. So keep this in mind as we go into our case study. Yeah, there are confounding variables or factors everywhere in data. And as an analyst, always be wary. Which is a great transition to your analyst role that you will be playing spiritually in this workshop. So let's set the stage. You're all analysts at a fictitious company by the name of CableMax. CableMax exists in our hearts, minds, and in practical A/B testing. I wrote about CableMax. It's a fictitious company I had in my book. I couldn't reference any of the companies I actually worked with. So I made up a company that is inspired by everything that I've done in my career working on A/B testing for like 15 years. Yeah, you get the joke. Cable, Comcast, Max could be referenced like at any company. So yeah, analyst playbook for today. So what we're going to do is we're going to review experiment together. We're going to analyze an initial data using mock data sets. We'll question why the initial data looks like, or the initial insights looks as such. Then we'll rerun the experiment to combat false positives, which is a very good practice. Then we'll do more analysis, and then we'll conclude our insights. So this is a day in the life of an analyst at a company running experiments, but on turbo speed, because you would probably do this in a span of a month or a few weeks. We're going to do it in one day, 1 hour. Quick caveat. For this analyst role, I would have loved to share these data sets and would have loved to query them together and have like a Dropbox folder where you could have done that. But for this workshop, it's just too time sensitive. It wasn't possible. In the fall course that Brandon mentioned, we will have that. It'll be far more hands-on. But what I ask of you is don't focus too much on the SQL. Focus on like what we're doing with the data, like what questions we're asking, what insights are we trying to gain. It's about the data and not, so, I mean, some of my SQL is probably wrong. So like just focus on the data itself. Okay. So to set the stage for your analyst role, the hypothesis for this experiment that we will be running, that's very influenced by all of my experiences working at these various companies, including Spotify, we'll be introducing the For You homepage. If we introduce a personalized, recommendations-driven For You homepage, then we'll increase consumption of videos on the TV product. That's our hypothesis. Not life-shattering. Like, I think that makes sense, right? It's personalized rows. Users like personalization. Personalization uses AI and ML. Makes sense, right? 1 + 1, 2. All right. High-level mock of the experience. The test experience has a For You page. But the control experience does not have a For You page. And we are going to measure the effect of introducing For You to users. Every product that you use has a For You page. This is very applicable to like any company you work at. Okay, key A/B test details for this experiment that you all are running. We have success metric, which is going to be video consumption on a product. That's just how many seconds or minutes of video are you watching on the product. At different companies, that would probably be like purchases. Like at Etsy, it would be purchases. At Dropbox, it's a great question. I don't know what would be file opens. I didn't actually run A/B tests at Dropbox. But then at Spotify, it'd be streams. So similar, you just want to measure like what's the core metric that the business cares about. The test type, this is important. It's an isolated experiment maintaining user exclusivity. So what this means is that the users will not be assigned to any other A/B test. If they're not assigned to any other A/B test, that means that we have higher confidence that any change that we're observing is because of this A/B test. Very simple. There are a lot of companies that are running non-inclusive A/B tests where your A/B tests your users are actually allocated to many experiments. And that analysis would look a lot different. I'm trying to simplify it for this use case, and we're just going to run an isolated experiment. And these are also concepts that we'll be talking in way more detail in the fall course. And then we have our user segments, random selection. We know why that's important to combat selection bias. And then our core data sets. We have an experiment data set. That's a table that essentially details the A/B tests that are running on the product. We have the experiment segment definition. So those are the segments that are associated to the A/B test. So that's the users that are in the tested control groups within an experiment. Then we have video consumption. So that's like important engagement on the product that we're measuring. And then we have our user account attributes. It's a table that just has a user. It has their tenure on the product, how long they've been on the product, localization attributes, where are they located, what subscription tier do they have, etc. Just attributes about the user, metadata about the user. And all of these data sets are going to be key for analyzing the experiment as analysts. Okay, so analyst task number 1, initial analysis. Let's start with determining consumption for the tested control segments in the For You experiment. Really simple queries. So our first step, we're going to first we want to know what the segment ID is and the segment name for the For You A/B test. Very simple. We don't want to look at any other A/B test. We just want to look at the For You test, right? Second step, we want to get the users that are in the control and test segment. Very simple. High-level output of those two queries would be the first table. We have the IDs for the For You A/B test, and then we have the user IDs that are usually some like unique identifier that's like automatically generated by the platform that obfuscates like any PII data. And then associated to like what segment they're in. Are they in the test segment of the 4E A/B test or the control segment? Very simple, nothing surprising there. Okay, so this query, we're going to take what we found in the last query. So we're going to, let's take it from there. So we're going to start with the video consumption table, and we are going to join that with the experiment segmentation table. And essentially our goal is to find the consumption per the test and control groups per day. So we just want to know what was the video consumption for the test segment that got the 4U homepage, what was the video consumption for the users in the control group that did not get the 4U homepage, right? Here's an example of the table. So you can say for this date, video consumption was that many seconds for the test. And we'll have a graph, we'll have a pretty graph. Okay, let's look at this pseudo graph. It's not that impressive. We have a test variant, we have a control variant. The test variant, remember, the users in the test variant got the 4U experience, and the control, they did not. And so I would have expected, or I guess what would you have all expected? Is this surprising? You'd expect personalization, you'd expect AI and ML to be outperforming something that wasn't using AI and ML, right? All right, so as your role as an analyst is to understand like why this happened. Remember we mentioned like an A/B test tells you what happened. It's your job as an analyst or product developer or a product manager to understand like why is this the case, and not leave focus for the rest of this workshop. Okay, yeah. So what do you think? Did you predict the hypothesis would be true? I predicted the hypothesis would be true. I assumed that the 4U homepage would outperform astonishingly to the control experience. And that was not the case. So this was very unexpected. Let's rerun the experiment. This is actually a really good practice at companies to rerun an experiment to combat false positives and then also to get more data. You could also do back testing and relook at that data, but it also doesn't hurt to rerun it. Especially when you believe so much in a feature, you want to make sure that the insights you're getting are indeed the case so that you can make the decision that you want to make. Okay, so for the second experiment, we're going to do some upfront analysis once users have been assigned to the control and test segments. So here is our analyst task. We're going to do user cohort analysis. Let's ensure there is indeed no selection bias in the user account definition within the test and control groups. All right, one more pseudo-SQL. So this time we're going to be looking at the user account table, which has metadata about the user. So looking at the test and control groups, as you can see by the where clause, and we are going to group by the segment name because we really just want to know, we don't want to know it at the user level, we want to know at the segment level, what is it, is there any selection bias? Are we doing anything weird with our random selection where it would skew the results and make it look as such? Okay. So for this example, what we did is we are looking at subscription tier. So like one hypothesis could be maybe the control group and the test group have a lot of users that are in free, and maybe users that have the free subscription just don't really use the product. Maybe they use the product for like one TV show that comes on Tuesday nights and then they never log on. So let's see if that's the case. Like these are the type of questions that you'd be asking to understand why the data suggested such. So I went way deeper, but you can see at the top right, the subscription tier, the control variant, and the test variant. So the subscription tiers are free, premium, deluxe, student, okay? So like just imagine you get different amounts of videos available on the product with those different subscriptions. They look pretty much even. Like I wouldn't say there's much degradation or differences in those two. And then like let's look at the other attributes that you could think that would influence consumption. Primary language. One of the reasons why I looked at this was sometimes machine learning models skew towards the prominent language, like English. And let's look if maybe there's selection bias in our control and test groups. Maybe we have more users that are oriented towards French as their primary language, and therefore our recommendations aren't really meeting their needs because we're recommending English content. So this is why we looked at primary language. And it seems looks fine. Like I don't see anything. 61% for controlled test variant. Spanish, primary language, 18%. So this is defining the users within the tested control groups. So I see nothing suspicious there. Same thing with customer tenure. This one's an interesting one. A lot of products do A/B testing with new users because they think there's like no bias with the product because they're brand new. Like Netflix has so many posts about how they've done a lot of testing on new users. So sometimes some companies will have this as like a targeting attribute in your A/B test, meaning like only run this test with new users. Other companies, they like get a mixed bag. They want to understand, regardless of product tenure, how the feature is performing. So for this For You A/B test, also don't see any issues like new users, so 0 to 5 months, 13% for the control group, 13% for the test variant. I mean, that looks pretty good. It looks pretty even matched, actually. So no concern there. And then our last one, demographics by age. This is an interesting one to look at because different age groups use products differently. I can guarantee you my mom does not really use the For You homepage. I'm pretty sure she uses search. I think she just directly looks for like the TV shows that she wants to watch. Me personally, I use the personalization page all the time. So this is like a good attribute or lens to look at when you're analyzing insights. Okay, so we did this analysis. We looked at user cohorts, no issue. So I don't think this is why the graph looked as ugly as it did. It didn't look as inspiring and like, I really want to launch that feature. I don't think it's because of any of these attributes. So let's keep digging. Okay, our next analyst task is to look at consumption by cohort. Examine video consumption per user engagement on the video product. So this one's really interesting. Yeah, you'll see. Okay. So we have our test variant and our control variant, or our test segment and control group, and we are going to break up the users into two. So we are going to have users that are within a bucket defined as low consumers or not as active users, and then we're going to have a bucket called highly active or high consumption or active users, and we're going to compare their use. We're going to compare their usage and see if there's some interesting graphs that we can get out of it. So here's a pseudo SQL that we would do such. If we start in the tables that we're querying, we have the video consumption table. We're joining that with the segment definition so that we only look at users within the control and test segments of the For You A/B test. We're grouping by segment name. We just want to look at this consumption for the test and control. We don't want to look at it within, like at the granular user level. And then we have this have clause where we're defining active as a user who has more than 10 streams, and I guess it's an hour, I don't know, however many seconds that is. It's more than an hour, I think. However many seconds that is, and that's a highly active user. So this is, the output of this is just a table where it says these are the users that are active. So we have active users for our test group and we have active users for our control group, and we're going to compare them. That makes sense. So this graph was way better. This is like 10 times better graph. Like this graph should be printed and framed. This is literally what happened to me when I was running an A/B test. So essentially what this is saying is for users that consumed a lot of content on the product, the For You homepage was very effective and it actually increased their consumption. But for users that were not as active on the product, it didn't really do that. But I didn't explain that. Well, that is the case, but this graph says something a little bit different. What this graph says is users that are active on the product, for users that got the For You homepage, their consumption increased. For users who did not get the For You homepage, their consumptions did not increase as much as the users that got the test experience. So this is kind of telling us the For You homepage is effective for users that are more active on the product. That makes sense? Okay, this is why cohort analysis is so important. Looking at this from a different lens, active users consumption analysis. So what this is saying is, this is a little bit more complicated graph, but we're looking at the proportion of active heavy consumption users. So we're only looking at the test group. And what we see is 42% of active users increased their consumption by 9% within the month that the experiment ran. And then for 54%, so we'll get the next tier, active users increased consumption by at least 8%. So what this is really telling us is that this feature was effective for a certain type of user. Not for all users, but a certain type of user. And why that initial graph looked so not impressive is because we had users that were kind of skewing the insights or averaging it out, which is still accurate. It just wasn't telling us everything that we needed to know.
Yeah. What is the x-axis here? How do I read this graph?
Oh yeah. So this is streams, video streams. So this is saying 42% of users had an increase of 10 streams on the product because of the For You homepage. So it's kind of looking at this line, so only these users. And it's trying to tell us how much of those users actually saw a large increase. So if we go to this one more time, 0%. So 2% of the active users actually saw 0 stream increases. Good question. It's complicated. Graphs are hard. Visualizations are hard. There's a really good book that goes into detail. I don't remember the name, but if you hit me on LinkedIn, I can send it to you. That goes into detail about graphs. It's literally 400 pages about graphs, but it's very good. I have not convinced someone to buy it yet, but it is very good. At Spotify we have education budget that we can spend towards buying books, and I think every month I'm you should buy this book, and nobody's bought it yet. But still very good graphing book. Okay, so your next analyst task. So what we learned there was the For You homepage was effective for users that are active on the platform, not effective for users who weren't active on the platform. So our next analyst task is consumption by primary language. So what we want to do is we want to revisit the cohort analysis that we did a few tasks ago. So we want to revisit this. We just want to look at this. And we want to redo that consumption analysis. Okay. So that query was going to be pretty gnarly and not something that I wanted to paste in the slides. So I'm just going to talk through it instead of showing pseudo query. So what we did here, gnarly in the sense that it would have taken the whole thing, or I would have had really small font. So what we did here is we joined users. We looked at users that's primary language was either English or Spanish, and then we looked at their consumption. But we looked at their consumption from the lens of were they an active user or a non-active user, and then we broke that down even further and then looked at it, were they in the test segment or the controlled segment. So there's a lot of joins happening on this graph. And let's break it down, ignore this part, and just look at the top. Okay, so this top graph, what that's looking at, the 2 lines represent the test variant. So the users that received the For You homepage, and then users that's primary language is Spanish, and that users that's primary language is English, and they're all active users. And so what's really important to note is that these lines are very similar, which means that the For You homepage is effective for both those type of users. It's effective for users whose primary language is Spanish and English, because you don't see a consumption degradation. They're both consuming similarly. And then this bottom graph, it's users in the test treatment and the control treatment, but they're the non-active users. So they're the users that use the product a little bit differently. They use it a little bit less. But it's also the cohort split where it's English and Spanish. And what you see here is it's very similar too. So this is just justifying or agreeing with our second hypothesis that the For You homepage is actually effective for users who are more active on the platform, regardless of what their primary language is. It's reconfirming what we are continuing to learn, which is the goal as an analyst. Okay, so was our hypothesis correct? Like the first one? Go for it.
I'm sorry, before you continue, I'm just curious if you've ever ran into a situation where you're filtering so much that you don't have enough data to use, and if you have ran into that, well, how do you overcome that problem?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, like what you're saying is that is it still statistically significant? Is the sample size large enough where I can actually make these statements? Yeah, I have. I mean, so there's like solutions to combat that, but it's needed like before you run the A/B tests, like stratified random sampling, where you create at a really high level. It's a randomization allocation strategy where you create stratas, which are groups, and then within those groups, you want to make sure that you're pulling enough from each group so that you can do this sub-analysis, if that makes sense. Random sampling should get you that, but if off chance it doesn't, then you can dip into that strategy. From my experience, this is literally a test I did like years ago. It's so detailed. It would be hard to make this stuff up, I feel. The thing that I had the biggest issue with, to be honest, it wasn't that we didn't have enough users, because we ran it like on 1 million users. Like, we had plenty of users. The problem was identifying the threshold for what was active. Not a lot of users used the product. Yeah. Like, it was like really, it was the Comcast product. Like, it was just people, so it just, all those users that didn't use it really skewed the data. And we even like tweaked the, like, I mean, this test, it's in the book, but like, or I could talk about this for hours afterwards, but like, what was fascinating about this 40 A/B test is that we ran it for over a year because we kept getting frustrated with the data that we were getting. Because the first time, our logic for creating, like, this is why this randomization, the segmentation logic is so important, but targeting criteria also matters. So, for example, the initial targeting criteria that we had defined to create the test and control group, it was just give me monthly active users. But that's not enough because like half of those monthly active users never actually saw the experience. So that was like a wasted 2 months. Like we didn't get any insights from that. And then so we kept like tweaking until we found like this is actually a good definition of a segment for us to actually know if this is effective or not. But that gets dangerous too, because at some point you could keep tweaking until you get the right answer. Like most data scientists, so I'm talking from the perspective of an engineer. I'm not a data scientist, but I work with data scientists. And like most data scientists will like hate what I just described, but it's actually like really effective. Like the ones that are very religious about their practice, they will say things like, you could find any data that's going to tell you to launch this feature. But it's not about that. It's about learning. You know what I mean? Like it's not about launching, but it's about like learning who this works for and then continuing to tweak it. You know what I mean? Like continue to go back to the product development board and being like, okay, so this 4U homepage works for these users. What can we do so that it works for other users? You know? So companies, you'll hear like it was a really good question, by the way, but you'll hear people define categorize experiments. So like this experiment is either like a test to learn. So regardless of what the insights are, I just want to learn. But then there's like tests to measure impact, and those are usually the launch candidates. And there's like a higher bar. There's less room for this type of deep analysis for that. Because again, you could keep finding the road that will lead to that launch. But if you're learning, like you can go as deep as you want, you know? If that makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, how would you avoid bias in creating segments? I can totally imagine, like theoretically you could segment on like gender or even, all kinds of other things which maybe might also not be so ethical in one way as well.
Yeah.
But how would you avoid the bias, and where would you put the limits on not segmenting based on certain features?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that's like a great question for features that are used in ML or AI. Like I think that is something that if you're building a machine learning model and you have a feature where gender is a higher weight, that I'd be concerned about that. With A/B testing, it depends what you're doing with it. Like, gender is not really, it's not no one looks at gender anymore. At least I haven't been a company that's been looking at gender for A/B test analysis. Like location is less harmful, but it depends what you're doing with it. Like if you're looking at location and looking at it from the lens of like, these specific locations are in developing markets that have lower bandwidth, and because they have lower bandwidth, their pages are taking longer to load, and therefore we have to decrease latency to improve their metrics. That's a great story. You know what I mean? Like you want them to have a better performing mobile app because they are in a market that has like different internet speeds. It depends on what you're doing with it. Like, or if it's like, I'm trying to think of like the opposite of that where you're not doing good. that I can't think of, but it's like, if you're looking at specific localities because you feel like you can give them poor quality experience for some odd reason, that's not good. You know, if they're a paying customer, they should get the best experience that they can. I don't know, I don't think I answered your question. Is that helpful?
It is in a way. Maybe just to say, how do you then avoid the bias? Like, how do you know, do you have customers' insight then cause you to select the features?
Don't know how to answer that besides a lot of companies have trust and safety organizations where they tell you like these are the attributes that you can look at. Like they're called algorithmic responsibility teams or trust and safety. Like I know Twitter, there's so many blog posts that they've written about the features that they look at and the segments that they look at. There's actually a really good blog post that I mentioned in my book too where they had some like image cropping algorithm and the images were cropping out like certain, I guess like certain genders or certain demographics. I don't remember exactly the details. And because they were cropping that out, that's bias on your timeline. So like you're only seeing like a specific type of person. And then the trust and safety / algorithmic responsibility group within Twitter. I think what they said essentially after that is like we have to start looking at this data from those demographic lenses. But yeah, I don't have really experiences on that to go more deep than I shared. Good question though.
I'm wondering what is the actionable insight from identifying that segment or cohort, if you like, where you can see a visible difference on the graph? Because at the end of the day, like the first graph was correct in terms of the numbers.
Absolutely.
And if you were to make ROI analysis and give a green light for this feature, you're going to roll it out across the whole population, not this particular cohort of our users, right?
Yeah.
So what does it give you to run this?
That's such a good
segmentation?
question. That's a super good question. I can answer that in like hours. So it depends on like what the goal is. Like if the goal is to introduce personalization onto a product and you find a set of users that do like engage with it, then you launch it so that you can keep iterating. You know what I mean? Like if the goal, and then you keep tweaking to make it better. But there was like with that first graph, like there were people that just didn't see it. That was the problem. That's like what I'm not saying. But like that graph was so low was because people just didn't see the homepage because they were in different parts. They were using search. But yeah, like when you're talking about ROI and like, that's a great point because like there's a lot of energy and time needed to support these features in production from like an engineering perspective, a product development perspective, a QAing perspective. Like at some point it becomes legacy code and you're like, why do we have this here? It's not really giving us the return we want. It depends on like the holistic vision of the company. You know what I mean? If the company is saying we use AI, this is the step towards it. You know what I mean? You gained insights, you understand this is effective for a certain set of users. Now let's build strategies so it's effective for everyone. Does that make sense? So like it depends on the bigger picture. But if there is no bigger picture, like don't launch it. Like you're just putting code in production that barely gets utilized. Makes sense. There's also so many organizational ways I could answer that. Like there's like a large engineering organization supporting it, then they're gonna want that out there. You know what I mean? So they can support that org's existence. You know, if you were to a big company, that would really resonate. Good question. Did I answer it?
I think so.
I just want to kind of build off that question. And by the way, amazing presentation.
Oh, thanks.
But since this is like actually a story that happened to you, what actually happened when you brought this data back to them? Because after you kind of segment it, it only becomes applicable and effective for that niche group of people.
Right.
Did the people reviewing this data after you decide to move on with it or not? And could you explain kind of
I
their
can totally go into
that?
like that's a great question. So that's like what I actually wanted to, not to continue, I don't need to continue to bring it to my book. Buy it or don't, it's all good. But like, that's the story I wanted to tell was what you just described. I wanted to talk about the cultural, the people part, the like how it looks like to bring data and everyone disagree and then you get more data and everyone disagrees and I have something I'm optimizing towards, they have something else that they're optimizing towards. The way essentially like the short version of answer to your question is at the end of the day it did make the product better. but it made it better for users that used that experience, the For You homepage. The company wanted to invest in more in that area. So it made sense. And it was very editorial. Like, it was very, like, everyone got the same stuff. And that wasn't the direction, like, the bigger direction the company wanted to move towards. So, like, one side of the company was like, yes, like, launch it. The other side of the company that actually loved editorial, like, they loved ads, they loved promos, was, like, way more hesitant. And that's why we had to keep digging and digging and digging for data. That first draft, there are actually times where the consumption was a little bit higher. And like what you'll see with running experiments in production, like a 2% increase is amazing. Like that is great. Like that is huge. But for a company that didn't want to embrace personalization, by the way, this is not Spotify. Spotify loves this stuff. So like anything I'm saying is not representative of Spotify. For a company that didn't embrace personalization, like 2% wasn't enough. You know, so we had to keep digging and digging and digging. To answer your question a little bit more, like it depended who you were talking to. Like if you were talking to a business person, like if I was talking to the VP of the business unit, they were like, it's not enough. You know what I mean? Like this is not enough to launch this. But then if I was talking to the VP of the product development of the video product, they were like, this is amazing because I want to keep iterating on this. You know what I mean? Like I want to add more personalization. So again, it depends on who you're talking to. Does that make sense? Good question. Yep.
Continuing in the same line, when it comes to defining these success metrics, ideally these should be defined before the beginning of the experiment, right? So how did you go about it? Because you just touched upon like 2% is good to one stakeholder versus 2% isn't good enough for another.
Yeah. Well, so we did define it at the beginning. It's always been video consumption, but to what threshold was successful? Yeah, that usually gets defined up front. Again, this was like a little bit of this is a very unique case study. I didn't pick like an easy test because the easy test isn't interesting. You know what I mean? Like if I just showed like, hey, we increased streams, like that's it. We're not looking at the data a lot. But yeah, like a stereotypical test is exactly what you said. Like you say, the increase must be by like X% for us to roll out this feature, you know, and you stick by that.
Did the goalposts move because of the length of the experiment? Say 6 months went by and then the goalpost suddenly moved. Was that a reason?
What do you mean by goalposts?
I mean the threshold. So in terms of 2% is good or whether 3% is good.
It was more, at some point, it became more about like learning. Like, what is this good for? You know what I mean? And like, what can we build on top of this? I mean, organizationally, there was a large AI org. Like, there was an org that you can't have a large AI org and not the product can't use AI. Like, do you know what I mean? So like, there was a lot at play here, organizationally and culturally. But yeah, like pretty much after that first test, after that first draft, our goal wasn't to launch. It was to like learn as much as we could and then build that roadmap and we did eventually launch it. We absolutely launched it. But it was more about gaining insights, if that makes sense. Yeah, purple.
Could you speak to stopping criteria of when you stop doing repeat testing? Of course, like resources.
Yeah.
But how do you know when you're like, okay, I was just wrong with hypothesis?
Yeah, I think so again, this is a very unique case study, but if we didn't talk about this, you wouldn't have asked that great question. Usually it's not. I mean, usually after the second test, you're like, okay, our insights were wrong. I mean, it's, again, like rerunning tests is a great practice for combating false positives, false negatives, but it's not like, it's not continuous. It's usually like after the second one, you're like, and it is so important to learn the hypotheses that are false. Like that is, like there's no failure. Like unless you like messed up the test and it's like misconfigured, that is a failure. But like if it's a trustworthy experiment where the insights are valid, but the hypothesis isn't true, that's a huge learning. If that makes sense.
I'm curious what you do. So in this case, you found that you mentioned that generally these results tend to skew towards the biggest group, which in this case the English-speaking group. So if you found that the English-speaking group, kind of the heavy users, the engagement increased, but then not so much for the Spanish group. What normally causes that, and what can you do about it?
Yeah, so that would be like an insight. So that would tell us what happened, and then we'd have to figure out why that was the case. Again, so like that's the theme of this whole presentation is like we keep figuring out what's happening, and then we have to keep figuring out why that's happening. So for that example, if users that's primary language was Spanish, if their consumption was like minimal compared to the English group that got the 40 homepage, then you'd have to like dig into the data and see like, are our recommendations only recommending English content? Like, are they habitually watching content that's in Spanish, but we're recommending English? Like, then there's something wrong with our recommendations algorithm, the training data, the features we're using in the model. Like, that would be the next rabbit hole that you go down. Does that make sense?
What was the debate that the business team was deciding on like whether 2% was enough or like to launch it? Was it more like, hey, we want to see more before we launch this, or was it something like financial resources? They wanted you to.
That's a good question.
Something else?
It was real estate. So like before this experiment, they owned the programming of the page. So like once we introduced personalization, they didn't own that, which means that our algorithms were deciding where their content was going, where they were like, we are putting Game of Thrones here. You know what I mean? And we are telling HBO Game of Thrones is here. You know what I mean? When the algorithm's choosing that, that's why this was this. You know what I mean? Like that was the core battle. Was this new way of distributing content? Because that's what these machine learning models do. They distribute content, but it's not as controlled. And when you have like a big company, one side wants to control it, the other side wants to like innovate because we feel like we can increase these metrics, you know?
Okay, so they basically said, we want Game of Thrones at the top of the page.
Or anything, yeah. And it's they lost control of the page, yeah. I mean, and we like worked with it. Like, there's so much more to the story. Like, they had like a featured row, and that featured row they wanted on the first page. But then I have graphs where it's like the minute we put that on the first page, consumption dips. But if I could continue watching on the first page, like consumption increases because like I want the stuff I want, my continue watching row, you know. So it was like a dance where we're like, okay, we'll put the featured row that has that Game of Thrones. We'll put it on the second like row. It was fascinating. Do you have a follow up to that? Nah.
No.
Okay.
You answered it.
Okay, cool.
Is there a reason that we're looking at daily differences, or is it enough to just look at in aggregate? Say in the past 2 weeks that we ran the test, there was a significant increase, or do we need to see that on a daily basis we're seeing that difference as well?
That's a really good question. You should look at aggregate. You should look at daily. If your product has specific consumption patterns. So for like a TV product, there is consumption patterns. Like more people watch TV on Sunday nights than Mondays or Tuesdays. And I guess we just wanted to see if there would be a difference. Like we just wanted to learn if like it's similar to like there's primetime traffic. Like there's like the Super Bowl. Like the consumption's so different than like a traditional like right now. Not a lot of people are watching TV. But for an experiment that was not as controversial as this one, you'd probably have like a box and whisker plot that was like aggregate. You wouldn't be looking at this granularity. So that's a good question.
I'm intrigued because I feel like historically when I've worked at some of these companies, like you bring the data and folks listen to it and they're like, yes, like thank you for giving this, like let's move forward with what the data's telling me. But it seems like in your case, you bring the data and there's a lot of pushback.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, like, can you talk a little bit more about the stakeholder dynamics? Like, do you think that pushback came from like not aligning with the right parties at the beginning of the project, or like just try to understand a little bit more about this?
Yeah. Another great question. Also mentioned in chapter 6 of my book. So this is like cool. And to be honest, I wrote this book like 2 years ago. So it's just funny to like hear these questions and be able to reference parts that I wrote. Yes. So like alignment is super important. And a little backstory, like when I did this, I was like a director of engineering. I was a 26-year-old, like I was just trying to do stuff and I just wanted to like make the product better. And that's one of the things that I think took me the longest to learn was that like meeting with them every month and bringing data to them was like not enough. Like I should have been meeting with them every week. I should have been giving them weekly updates. I should have incorporated their opinion from the onset of the test. Like, and that is what I do today, like as a more mature individual in corporate. But back then, like I just wanted to run. Like I just wanted to launch this thing. Netflix had a personalized homepage. Everyone else had a personalized homepage. And later in this journey of ours, that's exactly what we did. It was constant alignment. Like it was like every week we met with the business team. We said, what do you think about this insight? We literally ran custom tests just for them. Like there's a story that I can't tell because it's too long, but we paused the For You experiment to run a TV experiment where we slightly personalized their editorial page. And we gave them a boost. Like we increased consumption for the promotions that they ran. And that was like a win for them, not really a win for us. And then we picked up again with the For You homepage. Like it's all strategy. But yeah, it's alignment. That's like the key thing. And it depends on the company culture. Like at some cultures, that alignment's like so important. At other companies, you can kind of still run without that. And the data speaks for itself. Good question. Okay, I think we're reaching the end. The last few slides are just our hypothesis was false. But if we tweaked our hypothesis, this would be true, that the For You homepage worked for users who were active on the platform. So your role as a data scientist, I'm going to speak through this, is to ensure validity. Okay, so that is the number one role. Ensure validity and get insights. Your role is not to find data and like get it so that it launches. It's just to keep learning as much as you can. So keep in mind novelty effect, seasonality effect, confounding variables, like that ice cream example that we had at the beginning. And yeah, make sure you're running trustworthy experiments. Thank you.